You're watching $100 million shockwave tear across a desert. The relentless editing and kinetic scale of the spectacle pins you to your seat. We usually treat these massive action blockbusters as harmless escapism. At most, we write them off as loud reflections of national pride. These films actively engineer a political reality. They establish a world where state violence operates as a natural law rather than a choice. Take two vastly different modern case studies. On one side, Dark 30 justifies U.S. global intervention. On the other, RRR celebrates anti-colonial indigenous resistance. These two movies have completely opposite goals. One justifies an empire, while the other fights one. Yet both employ the exact same cinematic mechanism to consolidate domestic state power. Action cinema operates as an ideological engine, turning controversial state interests into unquestioned common sense. The Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci asked a specific question about power. How do ruling classes maintain control over populations without constantly resorting to military force? His answer was cultural hegemony. Power is maintained by dominating a society's culture, ensuring that the dominant group's specific worldview is repeated so often it becomes the default reality for everyone else. In this framework, concepts like heroism and patriotism are weaponized. They operate as discursive tools to align the audience with the goals of the state. Normally highly contested policies, like mass surveillance, aggressive regime change, and resource extraction, are stripped of their political baggage and repackaged as inevitable moral duties. To understand how modern geopolitics operate, we cannot look away from entertainment. We have to deconstruct it as the primary engine for manufacturing public consent. In the context of the U.S., War on Terror, cinema routinely frames American military might as the universal protector of global freedom. The 2012 film Dark 30 achieves this through an affective economy. The film does not sell foreign policy to the viewer. Instead, it sells the feeling of moral clarity. We can map this on a flowchart. Node 1 is state interests, realities like targeted drone strikes. Those filter through Node 2, the affective vehicle, channeling violence through an analyst's personal grief. This leads to Node 3, manufactured consent, making controversial actions feel necessary for survival. This cinematic mechanism successfully reframes human rights violations, such as torture, turning them from international crimes into a compelling story of national redemption. By collapsing the distance between the camera lens and the analyst's internal resolve, the narrative prioritizes the psychological safety of the state official over the physical survival of the civilians in the crosshairs. This reveals the core ideological grammar of Western action cinema. The center acts, and the rest of the world merely reacts. The other in these narratives, frequently the global South, is reduced to chaotic, inherently threatening spaces that desperately require Western order to function. To maintain this framing, the narrative must intentionally erase certain facts. The human cost of drone strikes, military occupation, and the lived reality of Pakistani civilians are completely scrubbed from the screen. The global media industry, centralized in the global North, actively marginalizes alternative narratives from the periphery by carefully controlling the terms of visibility. Making American dominance feel morally right inherently requires rendering the victims of that dominance invisible. This logic also applies to national cinemas that attempt to write back against colonial power. Rajamouli's RRR was globally celebrated as a spectacular story of anti-colonial indigenous resistance. We can map this on a parallel flowchart. The first node is subaltern reality. The film is built upon the real, historical struggles of Adivasi and anti-colonial figures, yet the narrative fuses distinct revolutionaries into a mythic brotherhood. This leads to Node 2, appropriation, repackaging tribal resistance into pan-Indian narratives. Finally, Node 3, consolidation. Resisting an external empire masks the consolidation of internal cultural hierarchies. Cinematic resistance can easily be spectacularized without being politically radical. Instead of challenging power, it serves to strengthen the dominant domestic state. We see this clearly in the specific erasure of Komaram Bhim, the historical Adivasi leader depicted in the film. Bhim's radical political slogan, "Water, forest, land," is visually stripped of its specific linguistic roots and rewritten in the film into Devanagari script on a white flag. The film constructs a strict narrative hierarchy. This subaltern character's political consciousness is depicted as flowing entirely from the benevolence and guidance of an upper caste figure. This represents a phenomenon critics identify as the Brahmanization of revolt. By framing the story this way, the film directly reproduces the exact social hierarchies that real-world Adivasi and Dalit movements are actively fighting to dismantle. This is cultural imperialism operating internally. Indigenous agency is only deemed acceptable by the narrative when it is authorized by the ruling majority. This hegemonic grammar is not confined to movie screens. It dictates actual domestic national policy. Look at the Ken-Betwa River Linking Project. Real Adivasi claims to their land and water are dismissed by the state as anti-development obstacles. In Ladakh, indigenous demands for ecological protection and local autonomy are similarly reframed by national media. These critical environmental demands are aggressively re-articulated as national security or integration issues to invalidate them. Or look at Manipur, a region experiencing complex, overlapping ethnic and land conflicts. The state narrative flattens these plural sovereignties into simple law and order problems, stripping away the actual history. The parallel is direct. Both the government and the blockbusters turn state extraction and dominance into common sense. When our screens consistently reduce subaltern resistance to a law and order problem, it builds the ideological alignment necessary for a public to accept their marginalization in reality. Returning to our two models, we can see that despite operating on opposite sides of the globe, Hollywood and pan-Indian cinema are running the exact same software. They are united by a master ideological grammar. The center acts and the periphery reacts. Whether the protagonist is a CIA agent hunting terrorists or an epic hero fighting the British Empire, the affective economy is deployed to prioritize dominant state interests. In both systems, the true human cost, whether that means Pakistani civilians or Adivasi communities, must be structurally erased to maintain the moral high ground. Cinematic spectacles convert systemic dominance into an emotional commodity, making global authority feel deeply, viscerally satisfying. This forces us to disrupt the narrative with a few basic questions. Whose safety is prioritized in our media, and whose grief actually counts? We have to ask whose history must be actively erased for the dominant narrative to function smoothly. Our primary task in a globalized media landscape is to distinguish between representation that empowers and representation that merely appropriates. We must cultivate counter-readings and demand counter-cinemas that refuse the universalizing claims of majoritarian heroism. We have to ensure that resistance remains specific, accountable, and rooted entirely in the material reality of the communities fighting for their lives outside the frame of the camera.